In the chronicles of Roman history, few individuals have provoked as much debate and intrigue as Mark Antony Augustus, also known by the name Eli. At just 14 years old, this Syrian boy rose to rule the most powerful empire ever seen, introducing religious customs and personal conduct that would astonish even the sophisticated people of Rome. What ensued was a reign lasting 4 years, one that defied every established norm in Roman culture, politics, and faith. The tale of Elgar is not simply about imperial indulgence or youthful recklessness. It symbolizes a clash between the East and West, between long-standing Roman traditions and exotic religious customs, between accepted gender roles and bold self-expression. His time as emperor revealed the deep divisions within Roman society, and ultimately contributed to the larger crisis affecting the empire throughout the 3rd century. To comprehend the significance of what Elgar embodied, it is essential to understand the backdrop of his era. The early 3rd century marked a time of extraordinary transformation for Rome. At its peak under Trajan, the empire had expanded to its widest borders, yet cracks were visible. Military threats from barbarian groups, financial instability, and political turmoil created a climate of doubt that defined the period. The Severan dynasty, into which Elgar was born, had introduced African and Syrian elements to the imperial sphere. At the peak of Roman authority, Mark's great-great-uncle, Septimus Sears, had secured this dynasty through military strength, and his heirs kept depending profoundly on the army. This reliance on military force would be essential in grasping how a young Syrian priest could ascend to become the ruler of Rome. Syria itself was a land of ancient cultures and mysterious religions. For centuries it had served as a junction where Greek, Persian, Roman, and Semitic traditions intertwined. The spiritual customs of this area predated Rome by far, with origins tracing back to the very beginnings of civilization. The solar god, Elgar, whose priest Elgar would ascend, embodied one of these age-old practices. The homage to Elgar focused on a revered black stone thought to be a meteorite, kept within a grand temple in Amma. This god was linked to the sun, fertility, and divine rulership. The ceremonies dedicated to this deity were intricate, featuring music, dance, and rites that Romans would find utterly unfamiliar. The priests of Elgar wielded tremendous power in Syrian society, fulfilling roles beyond the spiritual, including important political duties. Julia Donovan, the Syrian empress and spouse of Septimus Sears, introduced these Eastern elements into the core of Roman authority. Her sister Julia Mercer, along with nieces Julia Sloane and Julia Mayfield, upheld this legacy, holding sway that far surpassed the typical influence of Roman women. Traditionally admired, it was this group of influential Syrian women who masterminded Elgar's ascent to power. The political climate that permitted a teenage priest to become emperor began with the assassination of Carla in 217 A.D. Martin, the Praetorian prefect responsible for Carla's death, took control but failed to win the loyalty of the Eastern legions. The Syrian women from the imperial family saw an opening and started plotting their comeback. Julia Mercer, exiled by Martin, launched a carefully executed conspiracy. She spread whispers that her grandson Eli was actually the illegitimate offspring of the admired Emperor Carla. Whether true or invented, this assertion granted the dynasty the legitimacy needed to confront Martin. The young priest, bearing a striking resemblance to Carla and possessing an exotic charm, became the symbol of a rebellion that would shake the empire. The uprising began in May 218 A.D. at the legionary camp near Ema. Julia Mason had bribed crucial officers and soldiers with promises of bonuses and salary raises. When Eli appeared before the 3rd GIC Legion clad in purple and proclaiming himself as Carla's son, the troops hailed him as emperor. The rebellion quickly spread throughout the eastern provinces as news of the young ruler's alleged heritage and generous promises reached other legions. Caught unprepared by the rapid pace of the revolt, Martin struggled to respond. The revolt aimed to crush it by force, but his troops suffered a decisive defeat at the Battle of Antioch in June of the year 218 after Christ. The emperor, who once felt secure, suddenly saw his support vanish as one legion after another pledged allegiance to the teenage claimant. Martin fled toward Rome, but was caught and executed before reaching the city. The triumph at Antioch made Elgar just 14 years old, the ruler of the Roman Empire. However, the actual control lay with his grandmother Julia Mason and his mother Julia Sloane, who had masterminded his rise to power. These women knew that holding on to authority meant carefully balancing the army and the Roman Senate. What they likely did not foresee was how their youthful figurehead would start to pursue his own objectives. The journey from Syria to Rome lasted more than a year, during which Elgar solidified his rule and began to show his true nature. Unlike earlier young emperors who were satisfied to let regents govern in their name, Elgar demonstrated an early resolve to wield genuine power. His initial actions included eliminating supporters of Martin and promoting his own loyalists to influential posts. During this uneasy transition, alarming news reached Rome about the new emperor's conduct and intentions. Tales circulated about his unusual religious rituals, his distinctive appearance, and his ambitions to reshape Roman religion. Traditional Romans were already unsettled by these developments. Those wary of Eastern influences began to fear what this Syrian priest-turned-emperor might introduce to their city. The arrival of Elgar in Rome in the year 219 marked the start of one of the most debated reigns in Roman history. The young ruler did not come as a customary Roman commander, celebrating victory, but rather as an exotic monarch from the East. His very presence shocked Roman traditions, as he donned silk garments, intricate makeup, and jewelry that no Roman man would dare to wear. Even more unsettling than his appearance was the sacred black stone he brought along. This meteorite, carefully brought from Essa, was destined to be housed in a new temple on the Palatine Hill. For Romans, this represented an unprecedented religious upheaval. Never before had a foreign god been granted such a prominent position at the empire's core. The spiritual shift Elgar initiated extended far beyond simply adding a new deity to the Roman pantheon. He declared Elgar to be the ultimate god, surpassing even Jupiter. The conventional Roman gods were to be placed beneath this Syrian sun god's authority. The emperor himself acted as the chief priest, conducting daily ceremonies that many Romans found strange and unsettling. These rites involved sacred music, frenzied dancing, and complex rituals that clashed deeply with Roman religious customs. Processions turned into everyday events in the capital, with the emperor himself taking part in these rituals dressed in complete priestly attire, featuring flowing robes and a jeweled crown. For traditional Romans, such spectacles were a profound challenge to their religious customs. Even more contentious were the sexual and gender components of these rites. The worship of Elgar involved fertility ceremonies and gender-fluid religious expressions rooted in ancient Syrian customs, but utterly unfamiliar to Roman practices. Elgar's own involvement in these ceremonies, including adopting feminine clothing and behaviors during certain rituals, shocked Roman society deeply. The emperor's private affairs sparked relentless gossip and indignation. His marriage to Julia Paula, a respectable Roman noblewoman, lasted less than 1 year before he ended it to wed Aquilia C., a Vestal virgin. This marriage broke one of Rome's most sacred prohibitions, since Vestal virgins were dedicated to the goddess Vesta and pledged to lifelong chastity. Romans saw this union not only as sacrilegious, but also as a direct violation of their religious laws. Even more offensive to Roman sensitivities were Elgar's relationships with men. Historical accounts, especially by Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta, mention his marriages to male companions, including the charioteer Heracles and later an athlete named Zoticus. These partnerships caused considerable scandal and outrage throughout Roman society. The marriage ceremony was carried out completely, with Elgar taking on the role of the wife. The emperor's gender expression became more fluid and stirred controversy. Accounts describe him wearing wigs, makeup, and women's attire, as well as wanting to be called empress instead of emperor. Some reports claim he pursued medical treatments to change his body, promising great rewards to any doctor who could physically transform him into a woman. Although the exact truth of these claims is debated, they highlight the deep discomfort his behavior caused. The political consequences of these personal and religious shifts were significant. The Roman Senate, already wary of Eastern customs, was forced to join in rituals they found insulting and foreign. Senators had to attend ceremonies where they saw actions that contradicted their idea of proper Roman conduct. The emperor's neglect of Roman military traditions created equal difficulties. Previous rulers at least pretended to show military bravery, but Elgar seemed uninterested in military matters except for securing the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard through lavish gifts. His participation in military events dressed in Eastern clothing, his lack of enthusiasm for frontier battles, and his promotion of civilian priests to lead military forces all alienated the officer class and caused economic unrest. The policies during Elgar's reign showcased not only the extravagance of the Syrian court, but also the emperor's detachment from the financial realities of Rome. Enormous spending on religious ceremonies, generous gifts to favorites, and the erection of new temples placed a heavy burden on the imperial treasury. The long-standing Roman ideals of simplicity and moderation were cast aside in favor of Eastern notions of royal splendor. The emperor's court turned into a stage of excess that shocked traditional Romans. Grand banquets offered exotic delicacies and entertainment that many Romans viewed as immoral, with a level of opulence surpassing even the infamous indulgences of Caligula or Nero. Elgar himself would oversee these events, changing costumes several times within a single gathering. Palace politics grew more intricate than ever as competing groups sought to gain favor with the young emperor. Syrian courtiers, Roman senators aiming to stay influential, military leaders, and religious figures all engaged in strategic maneuvering. Even members of the emperor's own family had to carefully balance their support for his goals with safeguarding their own power. The transformation of the imperial palace into something resembling a Syrian temple complex was a tangible reflection of the cultural upheaval Elgar was driving. Traditional Roman architectural features were either supplemented or replaced by Eastern decorative styles, and the sacred stone of Eli became a central symbol, situated within a specially designed sanctuary that stood out across the palace grounds each day. Life inside the palace centered heavily on religious ceremonies that demanded growing amounts of time and resources. Numerous rituals occurred daily, requiring the emperor and his courtiers to take part. These observances often extended for several hours and included actions that Roman onlookers found exhausting and meaningless. The emperor's determination to personally oversee every single ceremony frequently caused interruptions and delays in official state matters. The mental strain on those compelled to attend these rituals was overwhelming. Roman senators and officials often had to witness and sometimes engage in ceremonies that conflicted with their own religious convictions and social upbringing. Some coped by considering these obligations as essential diplomatic formalities. Others quietly began plotting defiance. Foreign envoys and visiting dignitaries faced identical ceremonial demands, which led to diplomatic crises damaging Rome's international standing. Longtime allies grew uncertain about how to react to an emperor appearing more preoccupied with religious observance than with governance. Adverse nations started to perceive Rome as a state, weakened by internal strife and distracted leadership. Public reaction within Rome was varied but grew steadily unfavorable. While a portion of citizens initially expressed intrigue about these changes, discontent increased as the focus on ritual over practical affairs became clearer. Most people started to grow tired of the exotic Eastern customs because they disturbed their long-held religious traditions. The emperor's demand that Roman celebrations be changed to honor Elgar caused widespread dissatisfaction among the common people. Gladiator shows, a fundamental part of Roman entertainment, were modified to include religious themes that made them less entertaining. Traditional beast hunts and fighting exhibitions were either replaced or combined with religious pageants that audiences found dull and confusing. The emperor's own appearances at these events, dressed in Eastern attire, were received with growing hostility. The economic consequences of the emperor's rule began to impact everyday Romans, as higher taxes were used to support his religious projects and lavish court expenses. Merchants experienced disruptions in business due to frequent religious holidays and required ceremonies. Craftsmen were forced to work on creating religious items and decorations for never-ending rituals. Meanwhile, the military situation worsened because frontier defenses were ignored, while the court focused on religious ceremonies. Reports of barbarian attacks increased, causing veteran officers to doubt if a leader more preoccupied with religious duties than military tactics could properly lead Rome's legions. Provincial governance also suffered as governors, and officials were burdened with enforcing these religious changes. Religious transformations faced resistance from local communities, especially in the western regions, where open defiance against the empire's religious directives began to appear. The emperor usually reacted by increasing punishments for those who did not comply, instead of addressing the deeper issues. The situation reached a critical point when Elgar started meddling with long-standing Roman marriage traditions and family roles. His endorsement of sexual behaviors and relationships deemed abnormal by Romans triggered a serious crisis of social acceptance. When he tried to legally formalize these shifts, opposition gathered into active resistance. Julia Mason, the emperor's grandmother, who had initially helped him gain power, came to see that his rule endangered the dynasty's future. Secret messages exchanged with influential military leaders and senators showed a growing agreement that change was needed. The problem was how to find a successor who could keep Syrian influence strong, but discard the most divisive elements of Elgar's policies. Choosing Alexander Sears, Elgar's cousin, as the alternative was a strategic move to protect the family's authority, while removing the source of conflict. Alexander was younger, more adaptable, and, importantly, was not linked to the religious radicalism defining his cousin's time on the throne. Julia Mason started to carefully foster this transition. Support for removing Elgar while preserving family authority grew among military leaders who opposed him strongly. The main source of resistance came from the Praetorian Guard, whose allegiance had been secured with generous rewards, but was now fraying. The emperor's disregard for established military customs, his promotion of unfit favorites to leadership roles, and his visible disinterest in military matters had distanced even those who profited from his generosity. The conspiracy to end Elgar's rule began forming early, in 222 A.D. Key conspirators included his grandmother, prominent senators, Praetorian commanders, and certain court officials who were weary of constant ritual demands. The plan required precise coordination to guarantee a quick and decisive transfer of power. Meanwhile, the emperor's mental state deteriorated as opposition intensified. Historical accounts portray moments of paranoia, fury, and erratic conduct that revealed the extreme stress of leadership. His typical reaction to criticism was to increase harsh punishments and ramp up religious ceremonies. Numerous warning signs pointed toward the impending crisis during the winter spanning 2221 to 2222. D. Elgar's growing detachment from traditional support bases, coupled with his apparent failure to grasp the extent of resistance to his rule, helped accelerate his downfall. A situation was created where violent upheaval became nearly unavoidable, even as his closest allies started to pull away while the political climate worsened. The actual assassination of Elgar took place on the 11th of March, in the year 222 after Christ, during what was supposed to be a routine event at the Praetorian camp. The emperor had arrived there alongside his cousin Alexander Sears to address the guards, unaware that his visit was a component of a meticulously planned conspiracy. Upon arriving, he was confronted by soldiers who had already pledged allegiance to Alexander. The ensuing moments were both frenzied and merciless. Elgar tried to assert his command, but realized his usual authority carried no weight among troops determined to depose him. His efforts to escape failed completely, since the plotters had anticipated every possible scenario. The young ruler, who had once commanded full obedience, was now helpless against the very forces that had elevated him. Elgar's assassination was quick yet thorough. Historical records depict how the 18-year-old emperor was attacked by numerous assailants, ensuring no chance for survival. His mother, Julia Sloane, who accompanied him to the camp, suffered the same fate. The Syrian faction loyal to the dynasty was wiped out within minutes. The way the bodies were disposed of signaled a final rejection of all that Elgar had symbolized, as instead of the customary cremation, the burial customs given to Roman emperors were starkly ignored. in this case, as the bodies were dragged through the streets of Rome and finally thrown into the Tiber River. Such treatment was normally reserved for ordinary criminals and traitors, sending a strong signal about how history would regard his rule. Following the assassination, there was a deliberate erasure of Elgar's religious and societal reforms. The sacred stone of Eli was sent back to Syria. Temples dedicated to the Eastern god were rededicated to traditional Roman deities, and the elaborate ceremonies that had dominated the court ceased. Alexander Severus, influenced by his mother Julia Mayfield and grandmother Julia Mason, began restoring conventional Roman customs. The damnatio memoriae imposed on Elgar was extensive, yet not completely effective. While official documents were rewritten and inscriptions altered, the memory of his reign survived in historical texts and popular recollections. Ironically, the radical nature of his changes ensured they remained remembered, even if only as warnings against improper governance of Rome. Over time, the historical perspective on Elgar has shifted considerably. Early historians like Cassius Dio and the authors of the Historia Augusta depicted him as a vile figure whose reign embodied all the worst aspects of Eastern influence on Roman society. Medieval writers largely accepted this harsh view, adding their own moral condemnations particularly focused on his sexual behavior. Modern research into religious conduct has aimed to distinguish historical reality from ancient biases, recognizing that much of the information about Elgar comes from sources unfriendly to his rule. Current historians admit that Roman writers were inclined to see Eastern traditions as corrupt and overly delicate, which makes it challenging to evaluate the emperor's true innovations without prejudice. The issue of Elgar's gender identity has gained significant interest among today's scholars. Some argue that ancient accounts depict what would now be classified as a transgender identity, suggesting Elgar might be the earliest transgender leader recorded in history. Others believe his actions should be interpreted within the framework of Syrian spiritual customs rather than through contemporary ideas of gender. Elgar's religious reforms offer an early example of the kind of religious blending and experimentation that became more frequent in the later periods of the Roman Empire. His push to establish a dominant solar god foreshadowed certain elements of the religious changes later introduced by Anthony Augustus. Nonetheless, the approach he took and the moment in history made genuine success unachievable. The political lessons derived from Elgar's time and power go beyond matters of religious or social reforms. His narrative highlights the risks that arise when rulers become detached from the values and needs of the populations they govern, regardless of circumstance. No matter how absolute a ruler's authority seems, it ultimately depends on the agreement or acceptance of crucial social factions. When this acceptance is withdrawn, even emperors become vulnerable. The influence of Syrian women in both uplifting and toppling Elgar illustrates the intricate power mechanisms within the Roman imperial structure. Julia Mason's choice to sacrifice her grandson to safeguard dynastic authority reveals how political strategy could surpass family allegiance. The smooth succession to Alexander's seers demonstrated that the plot was meticulously organized to reduce turmoil. The financial and administrative elements of Elgar's rule shed light on the real difficulties the Roman Empire encountered during the 3rd century. His lavish expenditures and disregard for border defenses contributed to issues that challenged his heirs. Although the empire's monetary assets were immense, they were not infinite, and reckless spending had tangible repercussions. The military aspect of his tenure highlights the increasing significance of the army in deciding imperial succession. Even though conventional constitutional frameworks were preserved, genuine authority gradually shifted to those who could secure military loyalty. Elgar's neglect of military matters ultimately led to the downfall of his regime. The cultural effects of his reign went beyond immediate political outcomes. The tension between Eastern and Western customs that defined Elgar's leadership embodied deeper conflicts across the empire. The wider conflicts within the empire concerning identity and belonging continued to shape Roman society long after the death of the emperor. The historical portrayal of Elgar raises significant issues about the representation of gender nonconforming and sexually diverse individuals in history. Ancient hostile sources may have amplified or distorted elements of the emperor's conduct to emphasize political points related to Eastern influence and the preservation of Roman values. Recent archaeological discoveries from Emsa and other sites in Syria have offered fresher perspectives on the religious customs that Elgar sought to introduce to Rome. These findings indicate that his changes appeared less strange from a Syrian viewpoint than Roman records implied, reflecting authentic religious habits rather than personal oddities. The psychological aspects of Elgar's story continue to captivate both academics and the general public. The immense pressures of holding absolute power as a teenager, coupled with the cultural upheaval of relocating from Syria to Rome, created challenges few could manage successfully. His seeming inability to compromise or conform to Roman standards may illustrate both innate personality factors and cultural influences. Elgar's legacy in popular culture has largely been molded by the dramatic features highlighted in ancient narratives, from Renaissance artworks to modern interpretations. In contemporary novels and movies, Mark has often been depicted as an emblem of moral decline and excessive indulgence. These widespread portrayals reveal more about the societies that crafted them than about the actual emperor himself. The larger historical importance of his rule lies in its demonstration of the Roman Empire's ability to evolve and adjust. While Eli's particular reforms were dismissed, his empire eventually experienced religious and cultural shifts nearly as profound. His downfall might have stemmed more from unfortunate timing and approach, rather than the impossibility of change outright. Ultimately, the tale of Elgar stands as a compelling reminder of the complexities involved in interpreting history alongside the perils of unchecked power. Whether seen as a misunderstood pioneer, a disturbed youth, or a symbol of foreign influence, he remains among the most intriguing and debated figures in history. His short rule highlighted underlying conflicts and opportunities within Roman life that shaped the empire's future long past his brutal demise. The ruler who aimed to remake Rome in his own image ended as a warning about the boundaries of imperial control and the necessity of comprehending the cultures headed. His influence still sparks discussion and contemplation about authority, identity, spirituality, and the essence of leadership. The very pursuit of reshaping Rome to reflect his own vision by Elgar instead brought about his downfall and gave rise to a historical enigma that still captivates researchers and fascinates minds nearly 19 centuries later. This legacy remains a subject of intense study and endless curiosity, highlighting the profound impact of his brief but turbulent reign.